The 2008 recession hit many industries hard in Detroit. Real estate was an aspect, even to this day, that still feels the fallout. But during this time, there was also a project underway set to bring a thriving community of new urbanism to the Detroit suburbs. It was modeled after communities like Seaside and Celebration, Florida, and was the first project of its kind in Michigan. What's up guys, my name is Jake, and in this 90th episode of Abandoned, let's take a look at Bloomfield Park, a billion-dollar development that was stopped dead in its tracks, and instead of setting an example of what a walkable modern community could look like, it was left completely abandoned halfway through construction. So the area of this future site didn't really start growing until the post-war boom in the 1950s, ultimately seeing a myriad of small single-family residential homes as well as a drive-in theater pop up. The primary road it was situated along would expand in the 1970s, and this area as a whole would densify, at least as much as the suburbs would through the rest of the century. It wouldn't be until 1993 when developer Craig Schubiner began buying up different parcels of land in this area for future construction. Craig envisioned a massive mixed-use development in the Detroit suburbs, and this land just outside the city of Pontiac was ultimately the perfect spot for him. All in all, Craig would purchase 88 acres of land, and now turn his attention to design. In the 90s, a new wave of urban design was sweeping through America called New Urbanism. Basically taking elements that make European cities successful, like mixed-use walkable communities, along with pleasing architecture, and adapting that for North American communities. Craig wanted to expand his development to fit into this concept, and he commissioned the leading new urbanism design firm to draw up the plans for what was now being known as Bloomfield Park. Dwani Plater Zyberg and Company, or DPZ, was the same master planning firm that designed the iconic Seaside, Florida, as well as many other examples across North America. They were hired to draft up the plan for Bloomfield Park and bring a similar concept to Michigan. Their first concepts were completed in July of 1999, and it called for upscale living across over 1,600 condos with high-quality amenities. This was paired with over 2.7 million square feet of office space and over 470,000 square feet of commercial retail. This new dubbed downtown area would feature a health club, a movie theater, lavish parks, green space, and beautiful architecture, all tied together in a community residents and workers could walk through and enjoy, something that's not dominated by vehicles. By the year 2000, Craig took his idea to the public and sought approval to get the development started. But right out of the gate, there were some problems. The city had some concerns across the board, from their inability to fight fires on structures over 15 stories, even though the towers would have sprinklers, to the fact that the city wouldn't have enough police, to the usual suspects of increased traffic and density concerns. Citizens also echoed objections to the project, saying it would disturb the character of the area. What? Regardless, this pushback continued, and in fairness, the aesthetic appeal of Bloomfield Park had declined a bit into a more generic-looking community, straying away from the handsome architecture originally drafted by DPZ. And some of their concerns were understandable too, as despite the overall project being worth around $2 billion, it was unclear if the tax revenue the city would be collecting each year would be sufficient enough to offset the increase in municipal services. The city of Bloomfield, which was Bloomfield Township, was also going to take their time, indicating to the developers that it would be up to 24 months before any decision was made. Craig and his team of developers, however, weren't willing to wait around, and they ultimately found a solution. Their property was technically in the city of Bloomfield, but it was also on the border of the city of Pontiac. The latter was a once great city known for auto manufacturing. It's actually where the infamous Pontiac Silverdome once stood. By the early 2000s, though, it had fallen on hard times, and a flashy $2 billion development was unheard of in the city, and they could definitely use the tax income it would generate. So, they could annex this bit of land and put it under the domain of the city of Pontiac, where they had already indicated they would give favorable judgment for the development. In 2001, Pontiac put in a motion to do just that, leaving the annexation up to a vote. It would ultimately pass after both city officials and existing residents on the land, which the developers seemed to have bribed, all voted for the annex to pass. The city of Bloomfield, not wanting to lose out, also struck a deal to take in some tax income, all while enforcing a height restriction of now 8 stories. These changes forced the developers to scale down and rework their project, now bringing in Elkis Manfredi architects to adapt their development. Certain aspects of the proposal, like the hotel, would be moved to later phases, while the height reduction would cause the dwelling units to decrease down to 1,200. Finally though, in 2004, the project was approved by the city of Pontiac, and the existing houses on the land were condemned and demolished shortly after. This left a structureless plot of land with nothing but basements of the houses and the abandoned drive-in, which had closed long before Craig and his team bought the site. With plans of a 2007 opening for the first phase, in 2005, the developers opened up a sales center and launched a website, marketing the future development and pre-selling units, ranging from $350,000 to more than $1 million. By the end of the same year, more than $20 million in real estate had already been sold, around 25% of all units. After years of contention, lawsuits, and city meetings, both Pontiac and Bloomfield Township were both finally on board, and now encouraging its success. And it looked like that was going to be the case. The developers continued to sell units, touring prospective condo buyers through a master plan model as well as a mock-up unit. Retail tenants were also being signed on, with big names like H&M, Bath & Body Works, Victoria's Secret, Sephora, and many more, all set to occupy the retail section of the pedestrian-oriented streets. Construction still hadn't begun by 2006, and the Phase 1 completion date was moved to 2008. Craig Schuppener would ultimately decide to sell his project to a New York-based developer who would become the lead partner in the development. Craig would stay on as a consultant, but the bus was now being driven by a completely different developer. But still, even through 2007, work hadn't started, and the cracks may have begun showing in this ambitious, now billion-dollar project. It had been revealed that the developers had defaulted on a loan, resulting in banks suing for non-payment and seeking a foreclosure. The developers would ultimately pay it back. However, aspects of the project were then getting scaled back, decreasing the overall number of units again, as well as the overall capital expenditure. It was now being called a mixed-use lifestyle center rather than its original ambitious master community. But regardless, construction on the project would finally start in early 2008. That date sounds slightly ominous. Yeah, 2008 was not a great time to start a residential real estate project. Condominiums in Pontiac, Michigan, no less. Construction was well underway through most of the year, seeing multiple large structures rise from the dirt. Developers had brushed off the collapsing economy, confirming their rock-solid financial position. However, by November of that year, a major partner of the project, one who was providing the majority of funding, was unable to continue as interest rates from banks had soared. The housing crisis and economic slowdown had hit developers particularly hard, and getting any loans outside of their existing partners became impossible. Bloomfield Park's active development was suddenly paused. It became obvious that their 2009 opening date wasn't going to happen, and the whole future of the site was put into question. Over $200 million had already been spent on the project, and 14 nearly finished structures sat on the dormant site. With the developers claiming they didn't have the funds to continue work, a series of lawsuits were filed alleging they had failed to pay bills. In fact, they would be inundated with over 60 lawsuits claiming they owed over $20 million. Further lawsuits would come to light afterwards, some successful and some not. Basically, it was a massive mess filled with serious allegations and a whole lot of inaction, especially at the Bloomfield site. In fact, developers did little to protect their assets that were on site, only hiring a lonely security guard to watch the 90-acre property. But it was clear that the partially finished structures were deteriorating quickly, with weeds consuming the undeveloped land and weather staining the concrete labyrinth. By 2011, any hope of the original developers continuing the project had vanished, as the property was now foreclosed upon by Wells Fargo after the developers failed to pay a $48 million construction loan. The bank would now take ownership of the site, and would also now have to settle the outstanding money owed by contractors and figure out what to do with the development. Ultimately, they would settle many of these lawsuits, paying many contractors less than half of what they were owed, all while Wells Fargo put the site up for sale. After a few bids fell through, the bank would ultimately sell the foreclosed property to a company called Redico, a local developer, in 2014. They would assume the foreclosure rights, and this mess was now their responsibility. Assessments were made across the property to see what was salvageable and what needed to go. They did state that a mixed-use development would be in the cards, but only time would tell whether that was actually feasible. The company would later indicate that the scope and vision for the site would not relate to what was originally there, and that only commercial and low-density residential would be feasible. But still, time would pass with no tangible work on the site, and the existing structures continued to rot away. The massive property was clearly visible along Telegraph Road. So too was the original preview and sales center, still displaying the Bloomfield Park logo. But beyond the fence line, the property was nothing more than a ghostly shell of what would have been. The massive, unfinished structures dotted the landscape, with scattered construction materials and out-of-control foliage. When you're on the inside looking around, it's also shocking to see how far along some of these structures were. The towering parking garage, for example, had all of its structural concrete poured and even glass fitted in. Elsewhere, buildings had exterior cladding panels fitted on, which at this point were now falling off and decaying. The promised pedestrian-focused boulevards were now ghostly canyons with towering concrete shells on either side, all slowly falling apart with obvious damage throughout. Steel shells were rusting away, while unfinished drainage allowed water to pool on the concrete floors. Everything seemed like it was in a state of limbo, with the whole project standing as a local eyesore and a prevalent reminder of the recession. For explorers, this was a unique location in Detroit. Not a 100-year-old car factory or a decaying hospital, but an abandoned series of modern structures that were never even given the opportunity to be used. I thought it was fascinating, and while I never got a chance to explore it myself, I did observe it from the outside in 2016, awestruck by its sheer size. Literally a small, abandoned downtown in the middle of the Detroit suburbs. Through the same year, some minor work had been done, mainly preparing the site for future development, which Redico was finally committing to. They tore down the shell of the planned retail center, as well as dug up the foundations of structures that never went vertical. They would finally announce their plans by early 2017, stating that the majority of the existing structures would be torn down, and that this new development would start pretty much from the ground up. Their plan outlined a much smaller overall scope of amenities, turning the dense Bloomfield Park into the village at Bloomfield, complete with a few big box stores, a chain hotel, some senior and regular housing, and a whole lot of service parking. So by summer of 2017, the unfinished Bloomfield Park was demolished, tearing it all down and regrading the land. All but one structure was eliminated, that being the large parking garage on the east end of the site. It was left standing and would be later utilized as the garage for the comparatively tiny Henry Ford Medical Center. Elsewhere, other retail buildings would sprout up through the early 2020s, finally seeing a full build-out by 2023. A lot of people might wonder why they just didn't reuse the existing structures, as truly, this whole development was an enormous waste. Really, it seems that the decision to tear down much of the existing structures was based more on economic viability and the developers' preferences, rather than the actual structural integrity of them. The developers often went back and forth on whether they would be repurposing the existing buildings or not. It's obviously a lot easier to build something like this, rather than the ambitious yet more aesthetically pleasing plan before. What ultimately dominated the site was just more urban sprawl, completely innocuous and uninspired buildings that perpetuate more of the same around the area. A development built for a car-reliant community, and that even applies to the residential area. a bland series of 3-story structures among perfectly manicured lawns and asphalt parking lots. Though there are some reminders of the past around the village at Bloomfield. In certain areas, you can view the clearly abandoned and decaying boardwalk area around the lake, now being swallowed by foliage. Though perhaps the most telling reminder of the past is the massive parking garage, once built to hold hundreds of cars for a bustling community of thousands. Now it's just a towering structure that I can't imagine gets much use. And while I may be a little harsh on this new development, it's not like the original plan here didn't have its own issues. Honestly, I think the original plan was pretty great. I'm a big fan of new urbanism. I think building attractive and community-based developments is the best way to foster a great lifestyle. In the 90s, it seems like that's what Craig wanted to build. But his ambition also came at a cost, proposing a development that nobody was ready for. A counselor ironically said in 2001 that they were unsure of the project's viability and were afraid of a scenario which might leave it abandoned. He also pitted two cities against each other and caused a lot of public money to be wasted on lawsuits, all for a project that wouldn't even get started until nearly a decade after it was first proposed. When it did, the project had drastically changed in both scope and design, now in the hands of a lead developer that didn't even craft the original vision. The city of Pontiac also came out and stated that the development had decreased in scope so significantly that the tax incomes they would generate wouldn't even offset the amount of money they would have to spend on additional city services. The devastating financial hits of 2008 ultimately put the project into turmoil. And with the funding spigot suddenly running dry, they lost control of the property and just moved on. Wells Fargo certainly wasn't going to see it through to completion, and only a seriously ambitious developer was going to be capable of doing so. The ones who ultimately purchased the site were just not that, and this is what ultimately came out of it. But at the end of the day, you do have to admire the ambition of the original plan. It was a development which once was promising the introduction of a new way of living, bringing a healthy and sustainable lifestyle to Michigan. But instead, it became a constant reminder of the 2008 recession and the largest living failure of a master-planned new urbanism community, one which was left completely abandoned. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. These videos are a lot of hard work and very time consuming, so if you do want to financially support the channel, I do have a Patreon page where you can support me with as little as $1 a month, while also getting exclusive perks. But honestly, even just subscribing to this channel, as well as my second travel-based channel, Bright Sun Travels, is also super helpful. As always, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.